Hello and welcome back. Now, in the work on standard chord progressions, which has formed the main theme of this video series, we've been concentrating exclusively on chords built from the odd-numbered intervals of the scales and modes. That is to say, the root, third, fifth and seventh notes. In this session, I'm going to take a brief look at what happens when we replace one or more of those chord tones with one of the even-numbered intervals, that is, the second, fourth or sixth. Firstly, we need a little bit of historic background. Up until the classical era, it was generally accepted that the odd-numbered intervals of the scale were consonant, that is to say, harmonious intervals, which could be freely used in chord building, whereas the even-numbered intervals were considered to be dissonant or discordant intervals. That's not to say they couldn't be used in chords, but the rule was that if they were used, the immediately following chord had to replace the dissonant interval with a consonant one. For example, if we played a chord of C containing the fourth of F, then it would have to be followed immediately by a chord replacing that F with the major third of E to give us a C major triad. The use of the dissonant interval was called a suspension, and the chord containing it a suspended chord. This is normally abbreviated in chord charts to sus, or S-U-S, whereas the movement from the dissonant chord to the consonant chord was called the resolution. Thus, in this case, a C sus4 chord, or C suspended fourth chord, resolves to a C major chord. Now, it has to be said that this whole concept of dissonant and consonant intervals is a little bit arbitrary and rather dependent on context. I can illustrate this perhaps by using this familiar chord voicing of G, C and E, repeated G, C, E in the upper octave. And you can probably give a name to this chord straight away, but for the moment let's try and think of it in terms of a root position chord of G, which means from the G we have an interval of a fourth to the C and of a sixth to the E. This implies that this is a dissonant chord and requires to be resolved by resolving the fourth of C to a major third of B and the sixth of E to a fifth of D, giving us a chord of G major. However, a much more familiar way of describing this chord would be as a second inversion chord of C major, that is to say with the fifth of G in the bass. So if we consider C to be the root, then the chord tones are now a fifth, root, third, fifth, root, third. Quite simply a triad chord of C major and a consonant chord. So I've managed to turn a dissonant chord requiring a resolution into a normal consonant chord without changing a single note, just by thinking of a different note as the root note of the chord. As a slight aside, it's worth mentioning that if we do think of this chord as being a second inversion C major chord, if I move from there to the G major, effectively what I've got is a 4-1 progression or plagal cadence in G major, simply playing over a constant bass note of G. And now we move on a little through the historical record, because from the late classical era, that's round about the late 18th, early 19th century, the sixth has in fact been accepted as a consonant interval. And this is why you'll never see a chord notated as a suspended sixth or sus6 chord. It also means that if you play a chord with a sixth in it, there's no requirement to resolve it to a chord in which that sixth changes, for example, to a fifth. In contemporary music, notably jazz and rock styles, it's now quite common to find unresolved fourths and seconds used. However, chord charts will generally follow the convention of noting them down as sus or suspended chords, even if there is no subsequent resolution. And of course the familiar suspension resolution formula is still very much in use as a way of introducing dramatic tension and release into a piece. Now there's no time here for a comprehensive demonstration of all the possible voicings of suspended and sixth chords. However, I'll give you a few examples just to give you a flavour of how it works. So if we begin with this C, which we've already seen, we can play the suspended fourth simply by placing the little finger on the F on string 4 and playing the middle 4 strings. Note that the fourth is replacing the major third of E, so we want to keep this top E string damped. And then simply lifting that little finger and releasing the top E string gives us our C major triad, the resolution. I can play a C suspended second chord simply by playing the second of D at fret 3, string 2 with my little finger, and either damping string 4 so it doesn't sound, or lifting the second finger to leave it open, and resolve once again to the C major. I can form a C6 chord by using my little finger to play the root, and then use the third finger on string 3 to play the sixth of A. For an A chord, I can play the major triad with a partial bar over strings 4, 3 and 2, and then the suspended fourth of D with finger 3 on string 2, this is a voicing which can easily be transformed into a bar chord. We can play full bar with finger 1 and then use finger 3 to play the partial bar of strings 4, 3 and 2, and finger 4 to play the suspended fourth. Going back to the A, I can resolve this suspended fourth to a minor chord simply by taking the A minor shape and once again using the little finger to play the fourth. For an A sus2 chord, I can play the open A string, an E fifth with finger 1, another A with finger 2, the second of B on the open B string, and another fifth on the open E string, and then resolve it to an A major simply by playing the major third with finger 3. An easy way to play the A sixth chord is to bar the top 4 strings, leaving the open A open, which gives us the sixth of F sharp on string 1. Note that because the sixth is now a consonant interval, not requiring resolution to the fifth, the presence of a fifth in the chord as well as the sixth is not a problem here. And this shape can also be adapted to a bar chord, again by using the third finger to play the partial bar and the first finger to play a full bar. From E major, I can again play the suspended fourth with finger 4 and resolve to E major, or simply lifting my first finger, E minor. From the open position G, if I damp the major third of B on string 5, I can play the suspended fourth with finger 1 on string 2 and resolve. Popular pattern for the D chord, probably because it's relatively easy to finger, is to take our standard open position D fingering, and from here we can play the suspended fourth with finger 4 and resolve, or by lifting finger 2 to sound the open E string, we get a suspended second. Now, combining these movements from the suspended second to the major triad, suspended fourth, and back to the major triad, we get this kind of pattern. trick, you're probably aware that strings 4, 3 and 2 in the open position form a second inversion major triad, that is, fifth, root and major third. Using a partial bar of these three strings, we can move this very simple chord shape around the fretboard. Now, we can turn this into a suspended fourth chord simply by adding the fourth with finger 2 and resolve to the major triad. I can take this one step further by adding to the suspended fourth chord a sixth in place of the fifth, using finger 3 on string 4, and moving this pattern around the fretboard should sound somewhat familiar. Returning to my earlier point, I could note here that we could describe this shape as a first inversion major triad, that is with the third in the bass and then fifth and root, which would mean that this movement is a progression from a first inversion major triad to a second inversion major triad, with the root moving by a fourth. But again, context is everything, and I feel in this context the feeling we get from this is one of suspension and resolution, of tension and release. There's one final point you need to be aware of, and this is one of those historical quirks for which I don't actually have an explanation, but the fact is that if you see a minor sixth chord written on a chord chart, invariably what is intended is a minor chord with a major sixth added to it. If a minor chord with a minor sixth is intended, then it's written as minor/minor sixth. As a hint to guide you on your way to further studies, I'll give you a couple more things to think about. Firstly, you might want to consider what happens if you're adding even numbered intervals to a chord that isn't a tonic chord. For example, if you remember your modes, you'll realise that the 4 chord, if you added a fourth to it and wished to remain strictly within the key signature, would have an augmented fourth. A 3 chord with a second added would have a flattened or minor second. You might also like to experiment and see how it sounds when you add a seventh to either a suspended chord and or a resolved chord. I'll leave it to you to discover how you might make use of these ideas. Meanwhile, in the next video we're going to get away from chords for a little bit and have a look at some new scales. These are variations of the minor scale. So far we've been familiar with the natural minor scale, and I'd like to take a quick look at the two principal variations of this scale, that is the harmonic minor scale and the melodic minor scale. And I'll also be taking a dip into the world of blues scales. So, as always, I hope you're able to join me again for that session.